Dad cut me out of his will. 6 months later, his company called me for help. Hi everyone. Before we get into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel's reach has been dropping a bit, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, free, and helps us keep bringing you new and interesting stories. Your support means the world to us, and together, we can grow this channel. Thank you so much. Now let's get to today's story. I'm writing from a temporary account for obvious reasons, and I've changed some details to protect my anonymity. When I was 12, I gifted my father a wooden jewelry box I'd carved myself in shop class. My fingers were still bandaged from the cuts I'd gotten learning to use the tools properly. I'd spent weeks on it, sanding every surface until it was smooth as silk, carving his initials into the lid with painstaking precision. He glanced at it for maybe 3 seconds before setting it aside without even opening it. "That's nice, sweetheart," he said, already turning back to his newspaper. The next year, my brother Marcus gave him a t-shirt that read, "World's Best Dad," something he'd grabbed from a gas station on his way home from soccer practice. Dad actually cried. He hugged Marcus so tight I thought he might crack a rib, telling everyone at dinner how thoughtful his son was, how lucky he was to have such a wonderful boy. That's when I understood exactly where I stood in the hierarchy of Richard Blackwood's affections. My name is Elena Blackwood. Well, Elena Morrison now, though I've built my consulting firm under my maiden name. I'm 36 years old, and I've spent most of my life trying to prove myself worthy of love that was never going to come. It took me decades to understand that the problem was never with me. Growing up in the Blackwood house was like living in a museum dedicated to Marcus's achievements. Every wall displayed his soccer trophies, academic awards, and photographs from various ceremonies where he'd been honored for one thing or another. My own accomplishments, straight A's throughout high school, early admission to MIT, my master's in business strategy, these were relegated to brief mentions at dinner, if they were mentioned at all. Elena got into MIT, my father announced one evening when I was 17, the same way someone might comment on the weather. "That's wonderful," my stepmother Carol chirped, but she was already looking past me toward Marcus, who was recounting his latest conquests on the football field. Dad's eyes never left his golden boy. Meanwhile, Marcus was coasting through high school with C's and D's, spending more time at parties than studying. But every minor improvement in his grades was celebrated, like he'd cured cancer. When he managed to scrape together a 2.8 GPA senior year, Dad threw him a party. When I graduated summa cum laude from MIT, I got a card in the mail. The pattern continued into our 20s. I started my career at McKinsey, working 100-hour weeks, building a reputation as one of the most promising strategic consultants in the Northeast. I restructured failing companies, saved jobs, created value where others saw only loss. Business Week featured me in their Rising Stars Under 30 issue. Dad never mentioned it. Marcus, meanwhile, drifted from one failed venture to another. A restaurant that closed within 6 months, a tech startup that never got off the ground, a brief stint trying to become a professional poker player that ended with him owing money to some very unfriendly people. Each failure was met with Dad's understanding and financial support. "He's finding his way," Dad would say. "He just needs time to figure out what he's passionate about." When I quit McKinsey to start my own firm, Dad's only comment was, "Are you sure that's wise? It's risky to leave a stable job." When Marcus announced he was going to try his hand at day trading with $50,000 of Dad's money, it was described as entrepreneurial spirit. I tried talking to Dad about it once, during one of our increasingly rare dinners together. I was 31, my firm was thriving, and I'd just closed a deal that saved 300 jobs at a manufacturing plant in Ohio. "Dad, sometimes I feel like you don't see what I've accomplished," I said carefully, cutting into my salmon. "I know Marcus is important to you, but I've worked really hard to build something meaningful too." He looked genuinely puzzled. "Of course I'm proud of you, Elena. You've done well for yourself." Done well for myself. As if my success existed in a vacuum, unrelated to him or worthy of his recognition. "But you never really celebrate my achievements the way you do Marcus's," I pressed on. His face hardened slightly. "Marcus needs more support. He's struggling to find his direction. You've always been self-sufficient. You don't need the same kind of encouragement." That conversation haunted me for years. I realized that in his mind, my competence had become a reason to ignore me, not celebrate me. I was too capable to deserve attention, too strong to need love. The irony wasn't lost on me that my independence, the very thing he claimed to admire, had been forged in the fires of his neglect. Every achievement had been earned without his guidance, every success built despite his indifference. I'd learned to be self-sufficient because I'd had no choice. Carol, my stepmother, was a different kind of problem altogether. She'd married Dad when I was 15, a blonde real estate agent with ambitious social climbing tendencies and a talent for making herself indispensable. She was sweet to my face but had a gift for subtle undermining that was impossible to call out without seeming paranoid. "Elena's so career-focused," she'd say at family gatherings, her voice dripping with false admiration. "I just worry she'll never make time for a family of her own. Such a shame. She'd make a lovely mother if she could just find the right balance." She never said anything directly cruel, but every comment was designed to position me as somehow lacking, somehow failing at the fundamental task of being a woman. Meanwhile, she'd gush about Marcus's various girlfriends, talking about how wonderful it would be when he settled down and gave Dad grandchildren. I did eventually marry David Morrison, a kind, brilliant architect who saw my worth from day one. Our wedding was beautiful, intimate, everything I'd wanted. Dad gave a toast that lasted exactly 90 seconds and spent most of it talking about how proud he was that I'd found someone to take care of me, as if I hadn't been taking care of myself for over 30 years. Marcus was best man, of course, though he showed up 20 minutes late and slightly drunk. Dad just chuckled and said boys would be boys. David and I built a good life together. We traveled, we laughed, we supported each other's dreams. We tried for children, but it wasn't in the cards, something that Carol never failed to mention with her practiced expression of sympathy whenever we saw her. "Still hoping for good news?" she'd ask, tilting her head like a concerned bird. My firm continued to grow. I specialized in turning around family businesses, helping patriarchs navigate succession planning, resolving conflicts between siblings who'd been groomed to compete rather than collaborate. The irony of my specialty wasn't lost on me, but perhaps that's what made me so good at it. I understood the dynamics intimately. By the time I was 35, I was regularly featured in Harvard Business Review, had been invited to speak at 3 different TED events, and counted some of the most successful entrepreneurs in the country as clients. Dad would nod politely when I mentioned these accomplishments, then immediately change the subject to Marcus's latest get-rich-quick scheme. I stopped trying to win his approval around my 34th birthday. It was a gradual process, like recovering from a chronic illness. Slow, sometimes painful, but ultimately liberating. I focused on my marriage, my work, the life I'd built entirely on my own terms. I was happy, or at least I was learning how to be. Then came the call that would change everything. It was a Tuesday morning in March when my phone rang with news that Dad had suffered a massive heart attack. He'd been found in his office at Blackwood Industries, slumped over the financial reports he'd been reviewing. The irony was stark. He'd literally worked himself to death building a legacy he'd never allowed me to be part of. The funeral was a spectacle. Dad had been well known in business circles, and the service was packed with associates, competitors, and politicians all paying their respects. I sat in the second row, Carol and Marcus occupied the front naturally, and listened to speaker after speaker praise Richard Blackwood's vision, his dedication to family, his commitment to building something lasting. I wanted to stand up and scream. This man they were eulogizing, this devoted family patriarch, had spent my entire life making me feel invisible. But grief is complicated, and even neglectful fathers leave daughters with complicated feelings when they die. I mourned not just his death, but the relationship we'd never had, the approval I'd never receive. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following week. I didn't expect much. Maybe a small inheritance, some token gesture that acknowledged my existence. I certainly didn't expect to be completely erased. Marcus inherited controlling interest in Blackwood Industries, along with the family home and the majority of Dad's liquid assets. Carol received a substantial trust fund, and lifetime residence rights to the house. Various charities got meaningful donations that would ensure Dad's name appeared on buildings and scholarship programs. And me? I got his watch, a gold Rolex that had been his father's before him. The lawyer handed it to me with an apologetic expression, as if he understood how insulting it was to reduce my 36 years of being Richard Blackwood's daughter to a piece of jewelry I'd never wear. Marcus had the grace to look uncomfortable. Elena, I had no idea he was going to... It's fine, I cut him off, standing up from the conference table. It's exactly what I expected. But it wasn't fine. That night, I sat in my home office staring at that watch, David's hand warm on my shoulder, and felt something break inside me that I hadn't known was still intact. Some last, stubborn hope that maybe, somehow, Dad had seen my worth even if he'd never expressed it. The watch wasn't just an insult, it was a message. Even in death, Dad was telling me I was worth exactly one small symbolic gesture. Marcus would carry on the family legacy, Carol would be comfortable for life, and I would have a timepiece to remember my father by, as if I were some distant relative rather than his own flesh and blood. I put the watch in a drawer and tried to move on. My business was thriving, my marriage was solid, and I had a life I'd built entirely independent of Richard Blackwood's approval or money. I didn't need his inheritance to validate my worth. But 6 months later, everything changed. I was in my office on a Friday afternoon, reviewing quarterly reports for one of my client companies, when my assistant knocked on the door. "There's a James Richardson on line 2, she said. "He says he's calling from Blackwood Industries, says it's urgent." I almost told her to take a message. I had no desire to hear from anyone associated with Dad's company, but something in her tone made me pick up the phone. Elena Morrison speaking. "Ms. Morrison, this is James Richardson. I was your father's CFO, and I'm now serving as interim CEO of Blackwood Industries." His voice was strained, professional, but clearly stressed. "I apologize for calling you directly, but we're facing a crisis that requires immediate attention. And frankly, you're the only person I can think of who might be able to help us." I leaned back in my chair, curious despite myself. "What kind of crisis?" "The kind that could destroy everything your father built," he said bluntly. "We've discovered some serious irregularities in our contracts with our largest client. There may have been misrepresentations in our capabilities. The client is threatening to pull out, which would represent 60% of our revenue. We're looking at potential lawsuits, possible bankruptcy." I was quiet for a moment, processing. "Where's Marcus in all this?" Richardson's pause spoke volumes. "Marcus is... well, he's overwhelmed. He's a good kid, but he doesn't have the experience to handle something of this magnitude. We need someone with real strategic expertise, someone who understands crisis management." The irony was so thick I could taste it. The company that had been deemed too important for me to inherit was now begging for my help. The business that represented Dad's life's work, the legacy that had been entrusted to Marcus, was falling apart without someone who actually knew what they were doing. "Why should I help you?" I asked, my voice colder than I'd intended. "Because despite everything, it was your father's company," Richardson said quietly, "and because you're the only one who can save it." I told him I'd think about it and hung up. That evening, David and I sat on our back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. He listened without interruption as I told him about the call, about the impossible situation I'd been placed in. "What are you going to do?" he asked finally. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to let it burn. Let them all see what happens when you build a legacy on favoritism instead of competence." "And the other part?" I was quiet for a long time, watching a cardinal land on our fence post. "The other part remembers that there are probably hundreds of employees who had nothing to do with Dad's choices. People with families, mortgages, dreams. They don't deserve to suffer because my father was a terrible judge of character." David took my hand. "You know what I think?" "Tell me." "I think you're going to help them because that's who you are. And I think you're going to be magnificent at it because that's what you do." He squeezed my fingers. "The question isn't whether you'll help. The question is what you'll ask for in return." He was right, of course. I'd already made my decision the moment Richardson explained the situation, but I spent the weekend crafting my terms. Monday morning, I called Richardson back. "I'll help," I said without preamble. "But I have conditions." "Name them." "First, I want complete access to all financial records, contracts, and strategic documents. No exceptions, no redactions. Second, I want final authority on all decisions related to this crisis. Not Marcus, not the board, me. Third, when this is over, assuming I can save the company, I want my name on the door and equity that reflects my contribution." "Elena, I don't know if Marcus will agree to." "Then the company can die," I said simply. "Those are my terms. Take them or leave them." He called me back an hour later. Marcus had agreed. Walking into Blackwood Industries that Tuesday morning felt like entering a museum of my own exclusion. The lobby was filled with photographs of Dad and Marcus at various company events, ribbon cuttings, award ceremonies. There wasn't a single picture of me anywhere, despite the fact that I'd graduated from one of the world's most prestigious business programs. Richardson met me at the elevator, looking harried and exhausted. He was probably in his early 50s, with graying hair and the kind of stress lines that come from trying to hold a sinking ship together with willpower alone. "Thank you for coming," he said as we rode up to the executive floor. "I have to warn you, the situation is worse than I described on the phone." He led me to what had been Dad's office, a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows and enough mahogany furniture to outfit a small library. Marcus was there, looking younger than his 33 years, surrounded by stacks of papers and wearing an expression of barely contained panic. "Elena," he said, standing up so quickly he knocked over his coffee. "God, I'm so glad you're here. I don't know what the hell I'm doing." It was the first honest thing I'd heard him say in years. Richardson spread the documents across Dad's massive desk, and I spent the next 3 hours absorbing the full scope of the disaster. It was worse than I'd imagined. Dad's company had been awarded a massive government contract to provide specialized logistics services, but he'd apparently overstated their capabilities by a significant margin. The client was now demanding deliverables that Blackwood Industries simply couldn't provide, and the penalty clauses were catastrophic. But that wasn't even the worst part. As I dug deeper into the financials, I discovered that Dad had been using company funds to cover Marcus's various failed business ventures. There were loans that would never be repaid, investments in companies that existed only on paper, a pattern of financial mismanagement that went back years. "How long has this been going on?" I asked Marcus, pointing to a particularly egregious transfer of funds to something called MB Enterprises. Marcus had the decency to look ashamed. "That was the restaurant. Dad said it was an investment, that he believed in my vision." "Your vision lost $300,000 in 8 months, I said, trying to keep my voice level. "Meanwhile, employees haven't gotten raises in 3 years because the company couldn't afford it." "I didn't know." "Of course you didn't know. You never had to know. Dad protected you from every consequence, cleaned up every mess, and now the entire company is paying the price." Richardson cleared his throat. "Elena, what do you think? Can it be saved?" I studied the documents for another hour, running calculations, identifying patterns, seeing possibilities that others had missed. It wasn't hopeless, but it would require radical changes and some very difficult conversations. "It can be saved," I said finally, "but not the way it's been run. We need to completely restructure the client relationship, bring in subcontractors to handle the capabilities we don't have, and implement financial controls that should have been in place years ago." "Can you do it?" Marcus asked, and for the first time in our lives, I heard something like respect in his voice. "I can do it," I said, "but it's going to cost you." The next 3 months were the most intense of my professional life. I moved into Dad's office, something that felt both surreal and oddly fitting, and worked 18-hour days rebuilding the company from the ground up. I fired the deadweight employees who'd been coasting on Dad's loyalty, brought in new talent, renegotiated every major contract. The government client had been on the verge of canceling when I stepped in. I flew to Washington, sat across from federal procurement officials who'd been ready to blacklist Blackwood Industries forever, and convinced them to give us one more chance. I presented a restructuring plan that was so thorough, so detailed, so obviously the work of someone who knew what they were doing, that they agreed to a modified contract that would allow us to deliver what we'd promised. I brought in 3 subcontracting partners to handle the specialized services we couldn't provide in-house. I implemented new financial controls and reporting systems. I restructured the company hierarchy to actually reflect competence rather than nepotism. Marcus watched all of this with a mixture of awe and something that might have been shame. He'd been nominally in charge for 6 months and had managed to nearly destroy everything. I'd been there for 12 weeks and had not only saved the company but positioned it for sustainable growth. "I don't understand how you know all this," he said one evening as we worked late, reviewing the final details of a subcontractor agreement. "I learned it," I said simply. "The same way you learn anything, by studying, practicing, making mistakes, and learning from them. The difference is that when I made mistakes, Dad wasn't there to bail me out, so I had to figure out how to fix them myself." "He really screwed us both up, didn't he?" Marcus said quietly. I looked up from the contract I was reviewing. It was the first time I'd ever heard him acknowledge that Dad's treatment of us had been problematic. "He screwed you up differently than he screwed me up," I said. "But yeah, he did a number on both of us. I'm sorry," Marcus said suddenly, "for all of it. For the way he treated you, for not standing up for you, for taking everything he gave me like I deserved it more than you did." I studied my brother's face. He looked older than I remembered, worn down by months of pressure he'd never been prepared to handle. For the first time, I saw past the golden boy facade to the person underneath, someone who'd been set up to fail just as surely as I'd been set up to struggle. "Apology accepted," I said. "But Marcus, you need to understand something. I'm not doing this for Dad, and I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for the people who work here, who depend on this company for their livelihoods." "I know," he said, "and I'm grateful." The moment of truth came in early September. The government audit team arrived to verify that we could deliver on our revised contract terms. I'd been preparing for this moment for months, but I still felt the familiar tightness in my chest as I walked into the conference room where our company's future would be decided. I presented our plan with the confidence that comes from knowing your material inside and out. I walked them through our new systems, introduced them to our subcontractor partners, demonstrated how we'd transformed a failing operation into something that could exceed their expectations. The lead auditor, a stern woman named Patricia Chen, asked pointed questions for 3 hours. I answered everyone without hesitation, providing documentation and evidence for every claim. When she finally closed her folder and said, "Ms. Morrison, I'm impressed. This is exactly the kind of restructuring we hope to see," I felt something I'd never experienced before, my father's approval, retroactively, through the success of his company. But the real validation came from the employees. Word had spread through the office about what I'd accomplished, how I'd saved their jobs when everything had seemed hopeless. The administrative assistants started greeting me by name. The warehouse manager brought me coffee without being asked. The sales team included me in their lunch orders. These people had known my father for years, had respected him, had mourned his death. But they were looking at me now with something Dad had never shown me: recognition of my actual worth. 3 weeks after the audit, Richardson knocked on my office door with a bottle of champagne and a grin I hadn't seen since the crisis began. "We got it," he said simply. "Full contract renewal, plus 2 additional projects they want us to bid on. Elena, you saved us." The celebration that night was sweet, but what happened the next morning was sweeter. Marcus appeared in my office doorway, holding a stack of legal documents. "I want to restructure the ownership," he said without preamble. "Equal partners. 50-50 split of everything." I studied his face, looking for the catch. "Why?" "Because you earned it. Because Dad was wrong about everything that mattered." He set the papers on my desk. "Because I don't want to be the kind of man who inherits what he hasn't earned while someone who deserves it gets nothing." I thought about Dad's watch, still sitting in my desk drawer at home. I thought about 12-year-old me, carving his initials into wood with bleeding fingers, desperate for any sign that I mattered to him. I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to prove myself worthy of love that had been conditional on being someone I wasn't. "Keep the controlling interest," I said finally. "But I want 40% and my name on the company, Blackwood Morrison Industries." Marcus smiled, a real smile, not the practiced charm he'd worn like armor for so many years. "Deal." That evening, I drove to the cemetery where Dad was buried. I hadn't been back since the funeral, hadn't felt the need to visit a grave when the man buried there had never really been present in my life anyway. But something drew me there as the sun was setting, painting the headstones in golden light. I stood at his grave for a long time, not really sure what I'd come there to say. Finally, I pulled his watch from my pocket. I'd driven home to get it, and held it up to catch the dying light. "You know what, Dad?" I said to the headstone. "You were right about one thing. I am self-sufficient. I don't need encouragement or approval or recognition from anyone else to know my worth. But you were wrong about everything else." I slipped the watch back into my pocket. "I saved your company not because I wanted your approval. I gave up on that years ago. I saved it because I'm the kind of person who fixes things instead of letting them break. Because I understand that a legacy isn't about who you love most or who you think deserves what. It's about the good you do in the world, the people you help, the problems you solve." A breeze rustled the leaves overhead, and I imagined it was Dad, finally listening to something I had to say. "I forgive you," I said quietly. "Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve to be free of this anger. I forgive you for not seeing me, for not celebrating me, for choosing Marcus over me every single day. I forgive you because holding on to that resentment was only hurting me." I turned to walk away, then stopped and looked back one more time. "But you should know that I'm going to make Blackwood Morrison Industries into something you never could have imagined. Something built on merit instead of favoritism, on competence instead of comfort. And maybe someday, Marcus and I will both understand that we were worth more than the roles you assigned us." 6 months later, Blackwood Morrison Industries was featured on the cover of Forbes as one of the fastest-growing logistics companies in the country. The article included a photo of Marcus and me standing together in front of our newly renovated headquarters, equal partners in every sense that mattered. Carol called me after the article came out, her voice tight with something that might have been regret. "Your father would be so proud," she said. "Would he?" I asked. "Or would he be confused about why I'm not just grateful for the watch?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Elena," she said finally, "I think you underestimate how much he loved you." "No," I said gently. "I think you overestimate how much love matters when it's never expressed in any meaningful way. The truth is, I'll never know what Dad really thought about me. Maybe in some buried part of his heart, he was proud of what I'd accomplished. Maybe he saw my strength and mistook it for not needing his support. Maybe he loved me as much as he loved Marcus, but simply didn't know how to show it. But it doesn't matter anymore. I built my life without his approval, saved his company without his guidance, and found my worth without his recognition. The watch sits on my desk now, not as a reminder of his neglect, but as a symbol of time past and lessons learned. Every morning, when I walk into Blackwood Morrison Industries, I see employees who know their worth isn't conditional on anyone else's approval. I see a brother who's finally learning to earn what he receives. I see a company that succeeds because it values competence over comfort, merit over favoritism. And in the reflection of those office windows, I see a woman who spent 36 years trying to win her father's love and finally realized she'd been worthy of it all along. Dad's legacy isn't the company he left behind. It's not the son he favored or the wife he cherished. His legacy is the daughter he ignored, who became exactly the kind of person he should have been proud of, who learned to value herself enough to demand that others do the same. I never needed his approval to be successful. I never needed his recognition to know my worth. I never needed his love to build a life full of meaning and purpose. But I got the last word anyway. The watch ticks steadily on my desk, marking moments in a time that belongs entirely to me. And every second that passes is proof that some inheritances can't be written into wills, can't be given or taken away. The inheritance I received from Richard Blackwood wasn't money or property, or even his name on a building. It was the strength that comes from surviving indifference, the competence that comes from having to figure everything out alone, and the wisdom that comes from understanding that the people who don't see your worth are telling you everything you need to know about their limitations, not yours. That inheritance was worth more than anything he could have left me in his will. And unlike the company, unlike the house, unlike the money he gave to others, it was something no one could ever take away.